Hi, my name is Bente, I'm the Norse Witch, and today I want to give you a little intro on where you can start out if you're really new to Norse paganism. But first, as always, a little Patron shoutout. Thank you really much to Els, Maggie, Betty, Misty, Daniela Lee, Cameron, Ines, Tiffany, Amy, Rhiannon, Dario, Colette, Soren, Braden, Bethany, Tel, Timothy, Coffee or the honorary gossip squirrel, Bjorn, Scylla, Ash, Lorna, Lucy, and Joss. And now let us hop into the video. So when I started out on my Norse pagan journey, I was kind of lost. I didn't really know what Norse paganism was about and where I should start. Like, when am I even allowed to call myself a Norse pagan? So I personally would have really loved some guidance on where to start out. If you have just come across Norse paganism and it really sparked your interest and you want to dive into it, it can be really overwhelming at times. And I found that there's not really that much resources online on where you should start. And that could lead to a lot of beginners just head diving into it, like hardcore, and just overwhelming themselves and then just stopping because they lose interest because they overwhelmed themselves with it. So I thought it would maybe be a good idea to give some kind of advice on where you should probably start and just give you the advice that I would have wanted when I started out. What's Norse paganism even about? This will probably highly depend on the person that you ask. For me personally, being a Norse pagan is a lot about getting into this mindset of the world is full of spirits and deities, land spirits, your ancestors, elves, dwarves. There are so many creatures all around us. The earth is so alive, and that is for me personally a really big thing when it comes to Norse paganism. It's not just about the gods and the goddesses. They are extremely important, yes, but the whole just mindset of the Norse peoples just incorporated so many more entities than just the gods and the goddesses, and they were also really important. So for me personally, I worship the gods. Of course, I have 3 or 4 main deities that I specifically work with, and the rest of them I just worship. For me, it's also about ancestor worship and ancestor work. I'm pretty new to that too, so you don't have to dive into everything at once, but I will get into that later. So gods, goddesses, ancestors, the land spirits or the landvættir are also, for me personally, really important. Spirits that are connected to you. So for example, your fylkja or your family's fylkja, the hamingja, which can be kind of seen as a spirit, and also other entities like elves and dwarves and whatever you will come across if you read the Eddas and the sagas. But yeah, this should be enough. This video is not supposed to be about what Norse paganism is, but where you can start out practicing it. So let's dive into that. The first thing, of course, and that will probably be the one thing that everyone will agree with, the first thing that you should probably do is do some research. You probably have some knowledge about it. I mean, at least you know about it and you know you want to practice it, so you probably have some knowledge already, but do some further research. I would suggest, if you're really new to it, maybe don't start directly with the Eddas and sagas because they can be really dry, and depending on the translation, it can be kind of hard reading them. So yeah, if you don't really want to dive headfirst into the Eddas and sagas because you're maybe not used to reading texts like this, I always like to recommend Norse Mythology by Neil Gaiman, because it's more stories that you can read. It's really easy. Yes, it's in English, but I think, or I guess there are probably also other translations of this book. And even if you read it in English, it's really easy to read. I'm not a native English speaker and it's pretty easy to read. You will get through it pretty quickly and you will get some kind of feeling for the stories. It's just important that you don't rely on that book because there are some things that Neil Gaiman kind of invented, and he kind of filled in some gaps. There's stuff in there that isn't originally in the Eddas. So you can start there. That's totally valid. I haven't read it myself, but I heard that Jackson Crawford's translation to the Edda is also pretty good and pretty easy to read. So that's also something that you could do. Of course, as I said, I haven't read it myself, so I can't really give a proper recommendation for it, but I'm planning on purchasing it. I only have the Eddas in German and I hate the translation, so I'm kind of excited to read it in English. So that is something where you can start, but of course it's really important to at some point read the original Eddas and sagas and all the other texts. For example, the history of the Danes. There are a lot of books. You will find them if you Google sources on Norse mythology and Norse paganism. You will find them, so I won't just list them here. But yeah, in my opinion, it's important to read them at some point so you know, if you read other texts, what is something that wasn't originally in the original sources, what is something where the gaps were filled in, something was invented maybe. If you have read the original texts, you will see where the bullshit is in other books, because there is some bullshit in some books. When it comes to some like introduction Norse paganism books, I personally really like The Way of Fire and Ice by Ryan Smith, because it's specifically about how to practice inclusive Norse paganism. So you can read that book free from any white supremacy, racism, bigotry, free from that. That's why I really like that book. And I think as an introduction, it, in my opinion, is a really good book. And speaking of white supremacy, bigotry, racism, everything like that, of course, in my opinion, it's really important to also do research on those topics, especially also on which sources, like which authors, which YouTubers maybe are very problematic and which you probably shouldn't support. Also which organizations you probably should support, like the AFA, for example. You will find out that there are a lot of authors, a lot of sources, a lot of groups that you probably should not support. You will find that out pretty easily. Just Google it and you will find it. Also probably do some research on how you can find out when just a random person is telling you some stuff about Norse paganism. Is it white supremacy hidden in Norse paganism? Is it not? Maybe like do your research on like dog whistles, stuff like that. Would probably be a good idea so that you're just prepared for your journey. Also, in my opinion, apart from just reading the Eddas and sagas and stuff like that, I think it's important also, and also just really interesting, to do general research on like general pre-Christian Scandinavian history, Germanic history, everything like that, because it will kind of give you some context for the Eddas and sagas. And now that we have talked about knowledge and doing your research, which is of course really important even if you don't want to be a reconstructionist Norse pagan, I think it's equally as important to kind of train your intuition. Learn to listen to your intuition, learn how to act on it, because in my opinion, the combination of knowledge and like research-based knowledge and intuition is extremely important. In my opinion, it's extremely important even if you are a reconstructionist Norse pagan, because there will be still times where you just don't have all the knowledge and you can't get all the knowledge that you would want and that you would need for something. So you will always have to fill in some gaps. And having a very good working intuition that you are very well versed in like listening to is extremely important in those instances. Even if you're not a really intuitive Norse pagan and more on the reconstructionist side, I think knowing how to work with your intuition is still very important. It will help you out immensely. So for me, those two things are the beginning: doing your research, gaining knowledge, and learning to work with your intuition so that you can kind of fill in the gaps where you won't get any further with your research. For me personally, what's really important in Norse paganism, and which will come up later too, is observing the seasonal changes and kind of being more in tune to nature. You don't have to be a hardcore nature lover, but Norse pagans, like back in the day in pre-Christian Scandinavia, they lived so close with nature. It was really important to them, like agriculture, harvesting, everything depended so much on nature. So people were living really close with nature and yeah, just interacting more with nature than we are doing now. Now that we are just living in our apartments and houses, going to work in another building, not really outside that much. I think it's really important to start connecting to nature more, to the seasonal changes, so that when you're coming around to doing, for example, Blóts for the seasonal festivities, you are well set because you already know, for example, when the equinoxes are, when the solstices are, what it feels like when the seasons change, where you live, all of that. I think that is a very nice place where you can start, because it can be as easy as looking outside the window every day and just looking at nature and seeing what's happening right now. And if you want to, also, of course, you can celebrate the seasonal changes in a small manner. Maybe give some seasonal offerings to nature. Like, it can be as easy as putting bird food outside in spring, for example. Or putting it out in winter also, when the birds don't really have that much food. It can be as easy as that. I wouldn't really dive into proper rituals yet, but just observing the seasonal changes and maybe celebrating them just for yourself maybe also can be a really nice thing where you can start. And then, of course, you get into proper work with the entities. So, for example, work with the gods and goddesses, the ancestors, the land spirits. I think these three groups of entities are a really good place to start out. I think, in my opinion, you don't necessarily have to directly jump into working with gods and goddesses. If it's for you much easier to connect to your ancestors or to land spirits, then it's completely fine to start out with these kinds of spirits. But no matter with which group you start out, things you could do at this point are maybe starting a small altar. Of course, you don't have to have an altar, but in my experience, it's a great thing to have, because there's just one focal point where you can give offerings, for example, and talk to the gods and the ancestors and the spirits and pray to them, whatever you like to do. It's just a good focal point for your practice. So maybe create a small altar. If you want to start out with worshipping or venerating the land spirits first, maybe you can create a very small altar out in nature, just with a flat stone and a bowl or something. At that point, just maybe give some small offerings regularly, talk to those kinds of entities. If it's the gods or goddesses, maybe pray to them and meditate with them and just get a general feeling on what do these entities actually feel like, how can I connect to them, how can I talk to them. It's not about properly doing like deity work at that point yet. Just connecting and feeling these entities is more than enough at this point. And of course, you can always do some more research alongside. If you, for example, start worshipping one specific deity, if you want to dive headfirst into worshipping the gods and goddesses, probably it would also make sense to start with one god or goddess, and then, of course, do some more research, like more in-depth research on that god or that goddess. Write it down, get to know the god, the goddess, or your ancestors or the spirits that you want to work with at that point. And I think personally, if you have worshipped and venerated a specific set of entities for quite some time, you will have a good feeling for them. You will have a good feeling for how to connect with them, what this entity feels like when they are maybe around. And I think that is the point where you are probably pretty well set for performing your first proper Blóts. So do that if you are at that point venerating or worshipping one specific god or goddess. Perform a Blót for them. If you're worshipping your ancestors at that point, do a Blót for them. You can perform a Blót for basically anyone. So whoever you're worshipping at that point, do a Blót for them. It doesn't have to be a huge one at that point. Just kind of start small, and you can always build up from there. And at that point, because you have already acquainted yourself with the seasonal changes and nature around you, you can also do more bigger Blóts on the seasonal festivities. So, for example, on the solstices and the equinoxes. You can do some research on what kinds of festivities have been celebrated by pre-Christian Scandinavians, and maybe start celebrating those. Get a little bit bigger with everything. And I think, honestly, on that point, you are very well set. You could then venture out into doing proper work with spirits. So, for example, proper work with a god or a goddess. Maybe just start worshipping more specific gods and goddesses. Start working not only with gods, but also with your ancestors. Just start building your practice up. Don't dive like headfirst into everything at once, because that will overwhelm you. So just start doing more of something or incorporate something else into your practice. Maybe you want to at that point also get into the runes, either for divination, or maybe you want to also get into more Norse kinds of magic, also possible. Yeah, and that is basically it. Of course, this is just my personal opinion. This is kind of the manual that I would have personally wanted to have when I started out on my Norse pagan journey, so I just hope that it will help someone else too. It probably won't work for everyone because people are different. My practice is my practice, and of course, this manual is just based on my practice. It will probably look different to another person, but as I said, I just hope this will help someone out who doesn't really know where to start. If you're also Norse pagan or heathen or however you want to call yourself, and you have some tips on where to start, then maybe also put them in the comments. And yeah, that way there are more diverse opinions than just mine. So people can look at the comments after they watch this video and find even more tips. That would be amazing. As always, I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe and give it a thumbs up. And also check out my Instagram or TikTok. I'm also there. Maybe check out my online shop, or maybe even consider becoming my patron. And I will see you in the next video. Bye!